So if you're planning your first Camino particularly, are you expecting to have an epiphany? You might get one, you might not. That's the topic for this week, coming right up. And so why are we talking about Camino Epiphanies? Well, there was a question, might have been on the channel or on Facebook recently. Someone, somewhat disappointed obviously, said, I didn't really have the kind of epiphany I was expecting. Should we expect them? Do they happen very often? They do happen, and I'll mention towards the end of this video a couple that have happened to me, quite sort of startling at the time. But I think if you're expecting an epiphany, is it realistic to expect it? I think there's a number of conditions that really need to apply. Look, and this is purely my perspective, as always on these videos. I'd love to get some comments down below on what you think. But from my point of view, having had a couple, I think it requires a few sort of pre-existing conditions, if you like. And I'll run through those and see if they resonate with you, and then I'll tell you about a couple of epiphanies that I've had towards the end. So first of all, what are we talking about with an epiphany? So I looked up the sort of dictionary definition, and it's a sudden and striking realization, one of those sort of light bulb moments. And I've had a couple of those that I'll talk about. There are also other things that people talk about, the magic of the Camino and moments they've had on the Camino. And I'll put a link down below to another video where I talked about some of those, and they were quite a revelation to me at the time. Unexplained things that happened, really sort of out of this world type of experiences. But we're not talking about this week. Okay, look for the link down below for that one. What we're talking about this week is epiphanies. And why are we talking about them? Because I think so many people look for them. So what are some of these conditions that I think create the environment, if you like, where you're more likely to have an epiphany? These are in no particular order. So I think firstly, you're probably in a state of mind where you're searching for something. And certainly on my first Camino, I was a workaholic, probably still am to a degree, really hadn't had a sort of proper break, probably, in my 57 years of life. It had always been studying and working and, taking care of other people. And I just needed to get off the treadmill, and I was searching for answers, and I'm not quite sure even what the question was, but I'll come to that later. It may be that, a lot of people are walking a Camino through a grieving process, as part of a grieving process. It may be they've got conflict in their life or key decisions to make. And I think, kind of that foundation, like where you're coming from, if you've got a burning question in your mind, I think that can lead you towards enlightenment, if you like, or whatever we want to call, this epiphany or whatever's going to happen along the way. So you've got to be searching for something in my mind. I don't think we can just go out for a 4-week hike and sort of, hey, let's see what happens. We've got to be in that frame of mind that we're searching. I think secondly, then, you've got to be open. And you'll hear a lot of people talk about this in relation to the Camino, that you've got to be totally open to new experiences. I look at that in a broader sense. I'm always open to new experiences, to other people, to lessons, and I'm kind of, my radar's up. I'm just much more aware of what's going on around me, and I think partly because I like to walk alone, you become more sensitive, I think, to the environment and what's going on around you, and things that you might learn from or experience that are going to trigger perhaps this deeper emotion, an epiphany, or whatever we want to call it. So I think openness is really important. Reflection as well. I find walking a Camino a deeply reflective experience. And so it's hard to do that if I'm not alone. It's a very different experience. So a lot of this is probably going to be coming back to, my preference for walking alone. But, however long you're walking, 10 days, 20 days, my last one was 60 days. That's a lot of time to reflect and think. And a lot of people talk about the Camino as being walking meditation, and oh boy, it is for me. You know, it's interesting when I reflect back to my very first Camino. I hesitate to admit this, it sounds really soppy, but I was so taken by that movie, The Way, and I loved the soundtrack and every element of it. I had the soundtrack on my phone, and I played that soundtrack I don't know how many times during my first Camino. You know, I'd be in the middle of nowhere walking, and I'd play certain tracks on that movie soundtrack, and it would just lift me, you know. And it was all part of my sort of reflective state, I suppose. It was, you know, sometimes music can maybe transport us from where we are in a degree, and make us more open to things. Funnily enough, I don't listen to music at all when I'm walking now. So I suppose I felt back then on the very first one that the music was somehow helping me get in the mood or something. I don't know. I enjoyed listening to that sort of music and chanting and all that kind of stuff. On my last Camino, I didn't listen to music once when I was walking, because I was totally absorbed in what was around me, in nature, the sounds of nature, reflecting my own thoughts. And I think that's very powerful as we're walking, that being in that reflective state. Number 4 I had down as meditation. And you call it meditation, prayer, whatever you like. I found on my first Camino, and you know, I don't want this video to come across as overly religious or anything, but I was walking my first Camino injured. I was injured at the start, and I honestly wasn't sure if I would get through the first day. I can remember getting off the train at near Montparnasse in Paris the day before, and it was the first time I'd walked more than 1 kilometre. I was walking to my hotel in Paris. It was the first time I'd walked more than a K, and it was the first time I'd been able to carry my pack in about 6 months. I had foot injuries and back injuries, and walking that 1K to my hotel, I thought, oh, I'm an absolute fool. You know, I was struggling. And so with that sort of background, I was just happy to be there, and I was so grateful to be there. And I kind of spontaneously, on that very first morning, I said a prayer, and it's become a habit for me. Every morning on Camino, I say that same prayer. And it goes along the lines of, you know, thank you, Lord, for allowing me to be here and take part in this wonderful journey. You know, I promise to be open and listen to any lessons or anything that you can provide for me along the way. And, you know, I'm ever grateful for just being another day on the Camino, something along those lines. And I would, you know, utter that prayer in the morning and in the evening, because every evening I just felt lucky to have got through another day, you know, with the injuries I was carrying. It was a pretty painful Camino. And so that sort of meditative state or state of prayer, that state of being grateful for just being there, I think was part of opening up to the experience of the Camino. So I think that helped a lot. The next one's going to sound a little bit odd. I put down as number 5 that I think a state of suffering helps. Do comment down below, but I think particularly based on that first Camino, it was painful all the way, and I did have a degree of suffering. I mean, let's put this in context. You know, I mean, people do the Camino in wheelchairs. They do it with prosthetics. You know, was I really suffering? You know, yeah, let's put it in context. But I felt physical pain. I struggled some days. I've probably suffered more from emotional pain. I felt guilty about being there, being away from home, from work. All sorts of things were going on in my head. And you know, I was trying to carry a pack with a damaged back. All of this led to a degree of suffering to some extent, and I think that added to the experience, to be honest. And why do I say that? Because it was at the lowest points when I felt like giving up, or when I was really struggling physically or emotionally, it was at those lowest points where these sort of epiphanies and experiences started to happen. So I'm not saying an epiphany can't happen if you're staying in nice hotels and having luggage transport and things like that, but for me personally, I think part of the physical, emotional and spiritual struggle puts us in a state maybe where we're more receptive to learning and experiencing things which will maybe provide us with answers. I know this is all sounding a little bit vague, but it's honestly the best way I can put it. Another element, I think, so number 5 was suffering. Another element, I think, is time. So number 6 would be time. And I think we need time on the path. So, if you walk 100 Ks into Santiago, seeking answers and, all of these things that I've described, are you likely to have that epiphany within 6 or 7 days? From my perspective, no, I don't think you would. And why do I say that? Because I think it takes time to go through the various phases of the Camino that you would often hear people talk about. Whether they exist or not, is up for debate. But certainly what I have found is that there is a stage 1 which is very much a physical focus, where you're just trying to cover the distances each day. You're getting used to walking, however far you're walking every day, dealing with aches and pains and so on. Once you become comfortable with that, and that, for my first Camino, it probably took 5 to 7 days. I was never comfortable, but I was comfortable with the process and dealing with it. You kind of settle into that. And then the second phase that people often talk about is that emotional phase, which could last another week, where you're struggling with why you're there and what are you doing this for, and maybe you're reflecting on people back home having to make do without you, or whatever. There's a lot of emotions can bubble up until you reach that sort of final third stage where things just seem to click and you're really in the zone. So I certainly found that on my first Camino, and I've mentioned it a few times. So what I'm saying, I generally suggest that you need at least 10 days on the trail, 10 to 14 days to get through those phases. I certainly found that on my first one. When Pat came with me on her first Camino, I think we were walking for about 8 days, and it was only on the it was the penultimate day coming into Santiago, it clicked for her, and she said, I get it. I'm really enjoying this now. Up to that stage, it had been, dealing with sore muscles and trying to avoid blisters and, all of that physical stuff. But it was after 7 or 8 days, she sort of said, I wish it wasn't finishing, So I think it's that 7 to 8 day period might be the sort of magic number for us, at least. So having said that, I think you need time on the trail to go through that process of understanding how to cope with the journey from a physical sense, from an emotional sense, and then maybe your mind calms down a little bit, where you're perhaps more open to finding answers if you're seeking answers and that type of thing. So my number 7 is declutter, which is kind of linked to all of that. And I think it's a question of not being distracted. Again, I think it's why I like to walk alone. So I'm just totally, alone with my thoughts, processing thoughts. Sometimes I walk with no thought at all and just enjoy the environment. It's probably why I like more remote Caminos now as well. It's strange. I'll just sit on a rock and watch the animals in a field, or watch some trees blowing in the wind. My mind is just still. So it's not distracted or cluttered with having other people around. And don't take this the wrong way. I mean, meeting other pilgrims or walking with other people is great, but they're also a distraction. You're chit-chatting and your mind isn't as calm, I find. And that stillness, I think, helps enormously to sort of clear the mind. And probably also, kind of linked with that, is the simplicity of the journey. And again, I'm not having a go at people who want to stay in nice hotels. I've done that, or use luggage transport. I've done that when I've been injured. I'm just trying to throw out some suggestions here as to what I think creates an environment where you might have some sort of revelation along the journey. And I think simplicity, along with the sort of decluttering, is a component of that, certainly for me. So living very simply, just, walking uncluttered with very little in a backpack, staying in simple accommodation, not being too worried about what food I find along the way. I'm always going to find food, but I'm not going to be upset if it's, very simple or more lavish or, homemade from a store. Nothing like that matters when I'm walking, as long as I've got a bed and something to eat, and that simple life, that stillness, being out in nature. I think all of that kind of, for me at least, creates the environment where I'm kind of open to connecting, if you like, to lessons or whatever that I might gain along the way. So that's been a little bit of a waffle, but I think there are probably some conditions that help. So if you're setting out in search of answers or some form of epiphany, maybe have a think about those things, and I'll pop them up on the screen at the end just as a reminder. Probably that decluttering is really the important element, and having enough time, giving yourself enough time on the journey, and a lot of alone time. But examples, I did say that I would share a couple of examples. Before I do, I should probably just say that don't expect an epiphany to happen. That's probably the easiest way for it not to happen. I think we can all go on Camino with very high expectations of what it's going to be like and the things that are going to happen. So I think just create the environment where maybe you're going to be relaxed and open to things, and just let things happen. So a couple of epiphanies. They may not be that much of a revelation, but I set out on my very first Camino seeking answers. Like I mentioned, I'd been working my butt off. I suppose I was wondering what it was all about, what was the purpose to all of this, maybe call it a midlife crisis if you like, but I kind of just wondered what was the point of all of this hard work and so on that I'd been going through for decades. And so I was looking for answers. And I reflected on this a lot, particularly in the first few days. No, I'm not forcing it, but when you're walking for hours and hours and hours, your mind wanders, and it's not a highly concentrated, forced process. And I realised during that first week that I didn't know what the question was. I was seeking answers, but what was the question? Was it, what's life all about? What's my purpose? And eventually, after I think about 10 days, I worked out the question. And the question was, what do I want from life? Okay, not that much of a revelation. But it was almost somewhat like someone externally asking me the question, Rob, what do you want out of life? And I thought, okay, yeah, that question had sort of formed over a couple of days, and I thought, that's probably the right question. Now what's the answer? That probably took another week. And I'm processing through, there was all the sort of tangible stuff. Business, family, what is success, what is accomplishment, all of that typical materialistic stuff. Oh, my apologies. Should have turned my phone off. I'll turn it off while we're talking. I'm filming this in the office. So, the question came to me, what do you want out of life? And another week or so, the answer came. Happiness. That was it. And that might seem like not much of a revelation, not much of an epiphany, but the environment that I was in, which was all about achievement and success and materialistic stuff and all the rest of it, that was a huge weight off my shoulders, because I realised that none of that stuff mattered at all. What really mattered was just being happy in life and all of the things that go with that. You know, contributing to the happiness of those around you, family and friends and whatever. And to be honest, it gave me a total mind shift in terms of things like work-life balance. You know, I run a business at home. It changed my attitude to how I run that, my attitude towards customers, attitude towards family. So it sounds very simple, but it was actually quite a seismic shift in my thinking. And it was quite comical, because I came back from that first Camino and Pat, my wife, had said to me, you know, you've come back rather like a monk. You know, so you've got to be aware of the downsides of walking these Caminos, because I probably came back, you know, very much less materialistic, and I suppose less driven in terms of a business sense as well. So, you know, that comes with impacts as well. So that was pretty much a slow building epiphany. There's another one that I will mention, and again, I'll put down a link down below, which is not so much about epiphanies, but things, quite magical things that happened on the Camino, because I think I was in this sort of state of being open and somewhat fragile. So I'll put that link down below. They're not epiphanies as such, but some pretty interesting experiences. So what was the other epiphany? The other epiphany was coming up to the Cruz de Ferro, and that was on my first Camino. So I've walked over the Cruz de Ferro 4 times now. And, you know, some people will say, oh, you know, it's not a traditional part of the Camino. It's only, you know, a few hundred years old, and people stuck across on a hill, and, you know, people leave all this rubbish there. And if you don't know the sort of story around the Cruz de Ferro, the Iron Cross, it's just after Fonteverdon, which in itself is just past the Storga on the Camino Francis. Traditionally, although some people say it's a pretty modern tradition, pilgrims would bring a burden from home, a stone representing burdens in their life, and they would drop that stone at the Cruz de Ferro in this sort of symbolic unburdening. There's a prayer that goes along with it. And you know, to a degree, they're freeing themselves from these burdens, and I suppose hoping for improvement somewhere in their life. And I can remember, I've been there 4 times, and it's been a huge impact on me every time. The last time I was there, it was interesting. I was with a couple of people who kind of stood off to one side and said, oh, you know, this is all mumbo-jumbo stuff, Rob. You know, we'll wait here while you go and pray at the base of the cross, kind of thing. I'm usually pretty close to tears when I'm at the Cruz de Ferro. I find it a very powerful place to be, emotionally and spiritually. And so that very first time I was there was very special, and I made sure I got up there just as dawn was breaking, so that it wasn't too busy. I intentionally had stayed in Fonteverdon, so that I was close, you know, to the Cruz de Ferro. It's only, I think it's about a 30-minute walk up from there, I forget. And I got there at dawn, so it was fairly quiet. And, you know, I dropped my stone, and I knelt and said a prayer, and again, my prayer of thanks for being able to walk this Camino, and, you know, said prayers for various family members and so on. And I went to stand up, and I couldn't stand up. It was like there was a hand on my shoulder. I literally could not stand up. And it was almost as if someone was saying, I think you've forgotten something, Rob. And it came to me. I'm not going to share what it was. It's deeply personal, but in the prayers that I had been making, kneeling at the cross, I had skipped something that really should not have been skipped at all. And I realised in that moment when I couldn't stand up, this is going to sound very strange, I know, and I stayed for a bit longer and made sure that I covered off that particular topic in my prayers. But I was quite shaken by that experience, to be honest. And it was something that, again, brought me back into focus on what should be important in my life. And it was something that perhaps I'd neglected. I know I'd neglected. And it was a reminder not to neglect it. So, yeah, I mean, that was quite a powerful experience. But there we go. You know, do revelations, do epiphanies happen? I feel they do from my own experience. Some people will be watching this and say, oh, what a bunch of rubbish, Rob, it's a hike, you know. Yeah, we've done it, you know, we had a great hike and that was it. I think it depends to a degree on why you're walking the Camino. If you're just out for a nice hike, you know, great. That's probably what most people do. I think a lot of people, are actually out there looking for something, looking for answers, seeking something, seeking truth. I don't know what it is, but let's just think about those sort of preconditions I mentioned. I'll put them up on the screen again. So it was, you know, I think it helps, you know, if you're looking for an epiphany, these things I think help, that you're actually searching for something, that you're walking with a degree of openness, that you're allowing time for reflection and meditation and prayer, that you might be suffering a bit, you know, physically, emotionally, spiritually. I think that leaves us a little bit raw and fragile and more open to things, that you're allowing time, you know, probably 10 to 14 days as a minimum. And probably the seventh one is, you know, decluttering your journey, enjoying the stillness, making this journey very simple in every way that you can. And, you know, if you're hoping for enlightenment or an epiphany, I hope it happens for you. Don't be worried if it doesn't. Get out and walk another one. But thanks for watching. If you're in the position of planning your very first Camino, I should just mention down below in the description, you know, a few lines down, I've got a list there of, I think, the 10 most popular sort of newbie videos. So do go and check those out. You know, it's about packing and footwear and avoiding blisters and all that sort of stuff. But thank you for listening to me drone on a bit again this week. But it's an interesting topic, I think, epiphanies, and a lot of us, I have to be careful how I say this. I mean, if you've walked a Camino, you know what I mean. You'll meet some amazing people, and people are very open. The Camino environment does that for some reason, and people will share deeply personal things with relative strangers. And I think, you know, we do come across a lot of people on the Camino who are somewhat broken, somewhat grieving, somewhat searching, who've had tough lives. So, you know, if you're one of those and these thoughts help you find something on the Camino, then that's great. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.